So, ultimately, whatever your type of plan is, whether it's linear or tonal, you kind of want to start thinking about like, well, what's in my picture? The simplest way to do that is with lines, and there's nothing wrong with that. It kind of gives you an idea of where the boundaries of the things are. I've always myself saw stuff more tonally, but you look at Ong and a couple of other people who are masters of line. And even though I'm not great at it, I've studied it and tried to understand what its uses and benefits are, even though I tend to think in sort of very blocky, tonal ways. Rockwell was a guy who could combine both. He kind of worked out where his lights and his darks were, and then he kind of worked out the basic form within a picture. Um, when I was painting in oil, and oil is such a different medium that you have to sort of work within its strengths and limitations. And one of its limitations is you just can't go painting pure white over pure black without it mixing together. And so when I would wander into a museum and I would look at these paintings by everyone from Sargent to Bouguereau to Gérôme, and I would look at how well controlled the values and the tones were, I would think, how on earth did they do that? And part of the way was with what was called the Grizzai, which was they would basically do a black and white painting, black and white version of the painting, and then modify that by subtly painting color over it. And what that gives you is immediately just a lot of control over light and dark, the simple breakup of light and dark. And that's why when you see a lot of people working in very simple 2-3 tone structures, myself included, it's kind of where it springs from, was that if you want people to, say, look at parts of the picture, you need to plan out a value pattern that focuses on what's important and ignores the rest. And even though tonal stuff came pretty easy for me, one of the books I think that really made a difference for me was this one called The Practice and Science of Drawing. And in it, the author, Harold Speed, broke down the bases of art into kind of two different approaches. One is linear and one was tone. And what was nice about it was for me, who did not see in line easily or naturally, he talks about what line does and its strengths and what it can accomplish and how to go about, working from life, blocking out something and looking for those larger masses, hitting those larger angle changes before you get into the subtleties. And then he talked about the benefits of tone, which is more natural to what I was doing, but you kind of need to understand both. If you don't understand line, then your tones aren't going to have as much finesse and design as you could be getting. And this is a great drawing out of a French academic book on how to draw from the cast. And what's great about it is they would break the basic form down into two values, light and shadow. And they would really push those and design those different categories. And when I was studying drawing at a school out in Calabasas by a guy named Fred Fixler, he was the first one who really pushed this idea. And this is after years of college. He pushed this idea of the simplicity of light and shadow. He'd always say, design your shadows. And the sort of simple, profound idea behind that is like, if you've got 6 hours to do a drawing and, you're just building up tone and making a mess of it, you're not really doing justice to what's in front of you. So by him having us draw in and design those shadows in such a sort of regimented way, with such emphasis of the shapes themselves within the edges and the quality of edges, you really learned what it meant to design a picture. And so that kind of thinking really showed me um, the mastery behind someone as graphic as an Alex Toth. And when I was in school, I really didn't appreciate Toth nearly as much as I did later. And these are just some storyboards that he did. But his ability to, and it's everything that I just sort of skimmed over, but it's what's important and how are you using just the fewest number of tones to tell that story. And Toth was a master of that. You know, in the simplest way, you knew what was important, you knew what to look at. None of this stuff is naturalistic at all. This is all very designed and very contrived. Excuse me. The real world, there's millions of tones that our eyes.
How much did I make the shirt?
Millions of tones that our eyes see, and our job is to boil them down to 2 or 3, so that we basically know where to look. We know what the important aspects of the story are, rather than just having pages of dialogue that don't go anywhere. And if you think that this kind of stuff doesn't work its way into the actual day-to-day working of guys like Deakins, I would say take another look, because part of what makes Roger Deakins such a great DP is everything we just sort of skimmed over for the past 5 minutes, and how he takes those same ideas and boils them down to, and this is another frame from a different DP. This is from The Natural, shot by Caleb Deschanel, and it's everything that we were just discussing, in that, you know, if you were to just take a snapshot, that this character would not separate this well from the background. This is all deliberate. None of this is accidental, even though it looks very naturalistic. All this is done so there's a feeling of realism to it, but you know where to look. It's not confusing. And that's something that only a few people, I feel, really know how to practice well and have mastered. It's very easy to get caught up into 1,000 details and pages of dialogue that, you know, don't really take you anywhere. And so that's about 400 years of history sort of boiled down into just a few minutes. But that's why it's important, I think, because, you know, you see about 100 tutorials online about people doing this little 2-value thing. But for me, when I started working this way, this is where it came from. It came from, you know, having to work with an analog medium and having to make an image work, and then having to make it readable, and, you know, figuring out a way to do that that also made a very strong, striking visual statement. Let's see. Nothing new. Okay. And so when I started teaching at Art Center, we were teaching, you know, the traditional way outside with oil paints or gouache or whatever. And then I went, okay, you know, as the digital stuff starts to become more and more part of the everyday, what if we drag these laptops outside and start trying to develop our own language while working from life? Because working from life is the hardest thing, because nobody has set the composition for you. There's a million tones that you have to design. Generally, it's pretty hot and uncomfortable. And if you happen to duck under the shade of a tree and you paint a boring picture, the reason is because you chose the easy, convenient way rather than walking around and trying to find a location that actually looked like something. And I found this out on my own. I would do these paintings, and I would come back and I would look at them and I'd go like, well, okay, the values are good, the colors are good, the lighting's realistic, but it's the most boring picture that I could have possibly done. Is there a simpler way to start, like, you know, breaking this stuff up and thinking about it in terms of, is there a few just puzzle pieces I can move around? And there is, but it means you also have to move your little stool from the shade of the tree. I'm gonna walk you through a couple commercial jobs that I did, um, and we can look at that same set of ideas in practice. So these are from Zima Blue, which was so much fun to work with Robert Valion. Um, so again, back to that simple statement. Um, for this particular job, I just thought it would be fun to start it off in analog because you can't erase, you can't, you know, overthink. You just have to sort of work through a bunch of little sketches. And what I would do is I would take this brush pen and just try to come up with a very simple pattern that kind of looked interesting. It kind of had a bold statement to it that wasn't dull. I would take those and then scan them and then start to develop them, you know, even more so that they would have, you know, you can still see some of the ink showing through, but I would clean up shapes and I would start to think about maybe a secondary tone. All the while, I'm just trying to come up with a very simple, very bold idea because you can spend days rendering something. And if you don't have a very simple plan, a very simple idea, um, you know, you're going to end up with something that you're going to be frustrated by because it's not working and you're not going to know why. And I say this just from years of experience. Like I would spend days, weeks painting something and I'm like, well, why does this suck? You know, I've been working on it so long, and generally it's not the wrist mileage you've been putting on. It's like, did you have an idea at all to start with? So I usually try to do pages of these things, put them away, and then come back and go, okay, which one grabs me? Which one's the simplest? Which one is the strongest statement? And I try to, if possible, get some time away between when I did these, between the emotion of when I did these, and like I try to come back objectively and see these things like somebody else would, because in the middle of it, you're all caught up in your own emotion and ideas, and it's really hard to be objective. So anytime you can put like an hour or a day between things, for me, I found that to be very, very helpful. So, you know, as these ideas are developing, then we start to take them a little bit farther, and I start building a a library of shapes. This is supposed to be a really dense sci-fi thing, and so what I really wanted to concentrate on initially was like, what are my silhouettes and what are my electric signs? And so I made all this stuff on separate layers, and I would move it around, and I would, you know, all the while I would be working over a template that I established that had the idea. But now as I start to refine those shapes and I start to refine those relationships, the beauty of digital is you can have these things on layers and you can move them around. You can go, all right, I think this is good, but let me walk away. And then you come back later and you go, oh, no, I've made a tangent here. Let me push this around here. Oh, wait, let me bring this up here. And then you show it to the client and they've got their own set of inputs on it as well. And this is another one using those same different shapes. And again, just going for, you know, the most simplest version of what this is. What's in the background and what's in the midground? What are my silhouette shapes and what are my sort of signage shapes, my light shapes? And every situation is different. This just happens to be what, you know, seemed to work best for a nighttime science fiction scene. And once I have that, and once we've done a couple color versions, I can use those same shapes and stuff. And once we've set a final design, I haven't wasted my time with the process of making all these little things. I can convert them directly into the image. So this is where I'm just starting to find relationships in colors. And at this point, I'm sort of assigning a color, and then I'm just trying to get some noise and texture, even though this stuff is going to get covered up. Trying to get some noise and texture on there so it isn't so bland. So there's like at least a little bit of randomness introduced into the image. So you can see, like, this is the base. I'll turn the rest of these off. You know, down here I've got a background that I've made from all those same different shapes and layers. And it's probably worth pointing out that none of this stuff is a photograph. Even these windows are all made separately. And this is something I've kind of come across when I've worked with people I really admire, and the fact that they are making all their own textures goes a long way into making the art very individualistic and not so cookie cutter. Because as soon as you start using photo textures, yeah, the piece takes on sort of a generic quality about it, because by nature of a photograph, it is less unique. And so the more photographs you pile onto something, the more, you know, generic it becomes. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're working on a super photorealistic type project, it's the fastest way to get there. But I'm a little bit more interested in style and pushing the abstractness of it all. So we've got our foreground. I call this my unify. Let's run through this. So there's those first initial shapes, and as interesting as that is, I've got to, like, you know, group it. So all this stuff has to suddenly, you know, become a layer. And then I want those lights to punch through more. I want some subtlety. I want to start carving up those forms. I don't want just a flat surface. I want to know where the alleyways there and where the breaks are in the buildings themselves. A little bit of glow, a little bit of outline. It's all pretty methodic isn't the right word, but you know, you just sort of see what the piece needs next. You start to go, okay, this is starting to become believable, but this is totally flat and fake looking. Okay, let me add some scale to it. Let me add some dimension to it, like that's a doorway going back into something. And you just sort of keep refining the drawing and the subtlety of lighting, but working within the value range you've established. If you go too light or too dark, if you break what you've done, then the piece gets really hard to look at and really hard to understand what's going on in it. These are all like very subtle changes, but it's those, even though everything is abstract, it's that little bit of detail that lends a sense of scale to something, a sense of, you know, implied complexity, a sense of implied realism. Because again, I'm not going for photographic with this stuff. But I want it to feel believable. And it's tedious in that, you know, there's no great aha moment. You just sort of look at stuff and go, all right, adding dimension here. All right, this looks a little bit out of scale. Okay, this looks a little flat. Well, let me put some form on it. Like here at the pipes, it's like, okay, that's interesting, but doesn't look like it's in perspective. Let me add a little bit of sort of implied roundness to it. And it doesn't have to be much, but it just has to be in the right place. So that's how you kind of start tying stuff together. And then the props themselves. So this whole section is just literally starting to layer on the little bits of detail. And again, I'm keeping it within a very narrow value range and color range. It's like, okay, this is a good block in, but now this is starting to feel really flat and made up against this stuff. So let me add a doorway and some dimension. Let me add some scale references and some texture differences. So it starts to feel like something. And none of it is super detailed, but the implication that this has dimension to it and thickness to it is what sells the illusion. Even down to, like, you know, adding this one line just to break it up, just to make it just a little bit more real and believable. And then the beauty of working in Photoshop or any other digital thing is once you've done one, you can, you know, duplicate it. Like these little guys. And here's the deal. Like, you know, I don't have a plan for every single thing. I might block these things in and go, okay, but they're not, you know, I need just a little bit of more glow down in here or what have you. So you've got a plan, but you're also at the same time improvising, adjusting, looking at, comparing to. And like this, I did this sort of phone booth thing, whatever it is. It's like, it's not really separating. You know, it looks a little flat. And even though I like a certain amount of flatness, I want the illusion of depth to it. So just by lightening it up and cooling it off, it brings it forward ever so slightly. And you can just see the props kind of one by one coming in. And then there's a whole sort of fog lighting pass level that goes into it. And then you have to add some more pipes to it. And, you know, when you look at the image when it's all finished and everything, it seems like, oh my God, how did that come to be? But going back through the, you know, the methodology, starting off with very simple designs that work, starting to build them up, and then starting to break them down and refine them more, and then sticking with a plan, but, you know, modifying it as you go. If that initial plan wasn't solid, this thing would not work. It would be a mess. And then here's another one I went through. So here's my base layer, again, using all those sort of really complex, interesting silhouette shapes and just starting to build them up in the background. Again, this is not a photograph. This is just me making my own windows and using it as a as my own little texture pass. Just because you can control the resolution, you can control the sharpness, you can control the color. You know, most photographs aren't high res enough for you to actually pull them apart and have them hold up. There's so much JPEG artifacting, and unless you're shooting your own like super high resolution 4K images and then doing really high res PSDs, by and large, you're working with maybe, if you're lucky, 1,000 pixel photo texture that's basically just kind of mushy and noisy. So we've got the basics. We've got the background, we've got a ground plane, and we've got these two side planes. And in the simplest way, that the ground plane and the background kind of represent one value grouping, this represents another with a few sort of spotlights in there that the eye can bounce around in. And again, it's the same thing. Like, this was not done first. It was probably done after I had a bunch of buildings in here. And I went, okay, I need something on the ground to break that up that looks like it's coming from lights. But just given the way that I layered this to hand off to compositing, it's just kind of the way it is. So all those layers, and I guess that's worth pointing out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
This is annoying.
Six layers of just reflection. Okay. And that's something I learned from some really amazing artists too, is like something looks like one layer and it's just not. There's tons and tons and tons of layers to make up a very, very simple looking solution.
Even fucking can use themes to.
Sorry, what? Did you have a question?
I think someone was just not on mute, but I have a question. So you make like all these amazing color palettes. Like, do you have the color palette for the art in your head before you start, or do you just kind of discover it as you go?
I guess everyone gets something for free, and I always got color for free. I never had to work too hard at color. It came naturally. I had to work at everything else: drawing, shape, silhouette, composition. Color was just something that's like, oh no, this looks wrong. I think it's a little bit more blue. Some people like Mobius, they got line for free. Oh my gosh, I look at Mobius's stuff and I'm just blown away by his draftsmanship. And I've tried to, because if I could do line work as cleanly and as simply as him, you could do so much work so quickly, but it's just not my strength. Even though I've tried and read and understood it, tone and color seem to be a little bit more in keeping.
May I interject and say that I really liked your line work for like the movie titles. I think it was Octopussy or something.
I never did any titles on Octopussy.
Was that? Oh, I think it's somebody else. It was a James Bond. Oh, I'm sorry, mixing up.
Okay. That's fine.
Closest I came to that was seeing it in the theater as a kid.
Oh, that would make you old, much older. Sorry about that.
No, this is awesome. So these layers that you're turning on right now.
Yeah, I've had to break these out for compositing, so they're not quite as nicely organized when I do them on my own. But it just kind of lets you see the laborious intent that goes into these things.
So you obviously make your own windows like you've discussed. Do you have other textures like that are kind of your go-to library arsenal? I
wish. Every job I make a different set of textures because every job is different. I wish I had my windows that I could reuse, but every situation is different and everything has different style to it. And I end up doing a separate texture file for every job, whether it's like wallpaper or wood or what have you. I wish I could reuse stuff. That would, certainly make my job easier.
How do you choose your colors? Your colors just are popping and they're very nice and bright with this orange and green and blues.
Well, this one's pretty simple. We were just trying to contrast this world, right here, which, and we had to reuse a lot of the same artwork. So, and they ended up pushing the blues and the purples a lot more in the final composite in the short film. But we wanted the opposite. So if this is going to be sort of lighter and a little bit, it ended up being on the cool side, then we just thought, okay, we just have to push this one red because he's going into the seedy part of the city. It is literally that simple. And what's the opposite of red? And that's green.
It's green.
Green just looks...
And then blue is complement to orange. It's like that transition of red to orange. And
yeah, it's the simplest way to just make things look pleasing to the eye.
okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
And we have another question from Kevin in the chat. Are you pre-designing each shape, i.e. the pipes, before you start the composition, or do you design as you go further along the process of developing?
On this one, yeah, we were, since I kind of knew that I was going to be doing a bunch of these sort of large city interiors, that I made up a bunch of shapes that would work with whatever sketch that I was working on. This is an exterior, by the way, but I would have that same sort of simple value pattern, and then I would make up just all these layers, because it's so much easier to do these on their own, to sort of judge them on their own as interesting designs, and then, you know, have the ability to move them around and reuse them and flip them and squash them. It just gets you there so much faster. It's an implied complexity rather than, you know, everything being 100% unique, especially on something this dense. To reuse stuff is just, you know, super easy. And so, yeah, I would start building my shapes in the sketch form. And then once we've agreed on what the composition is going to be, I already have all the shapes, and I can just start altering their colors. I can just start assigning a color to them and start bringing in a gradation or a texture or something. So yes. What else? What else can we talk about?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, like, your shapes are very clean, like when you start already. Are you doing a brush, or is that like lasso tool?
No, I'm actually building them with shapes. I'll show you. So, let me just hide this. So I want the ultimate flexibility. So I, as much as I can, I literally use the shape tool. And again, okay, you know, I've got this thing going on, and, you know, what if I bump it out here? What if it curves here? Okay, that's nice. Let's see, maybe I want a contrast by having something thinner come out here. Okay, that's nice. What if I want to have something like that? And then once you build these things in shapes, you know, you can go in there and you can adjust and you can move things around. You know, you can go, oh, that's more interesting, or that's more interesting, or what have you. And it gives you flexibility. And then you know, at some point you can't make everything with a shape. You know, at some point you might just go in there and start, you know, like, okay, maybe add a line here. How does that feel? What if I do that? What if I do that? Okay, that's getting a little bit repetitive. What if I cut that in a third and do something like that? You're really looking at this stuff as graphic design. You're really looking at every stage of it as a type of graphic design. At least I am, because, you know, that's how I've been able to address what I feel are my weaknesses, is by breaking things down into just shapes and looking at them as just shapes and being able to adjust and go, okay, you know what, this one here, this feels kind of awkward, kind of repetitive. Maybe I can go in there now and, you know, adjust it. Maybe I can select just that one. Anyway.
Where do you get your inspiration from with these cityscapes? Like, are you constantly like in normal times traveling and taking photos, or like what inspires you?
You know, commercial jobs, it's not just what inspires you, it's what's in the director's head and what's in the script. And, you know, you have to work with all these different ideas to, and then maintain a level of consistency and maintain a level of, quality. So it's not just a matter of like, oh, I had this idea. It was just like, no, the director had this influence and this reference. And my job is to try to maintain the spirit of that while also, like, you know, bringing a little bit of my own, what have you, knowledge and, or, you know, training into it.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi. Good morning. What I want to concept a student in the art and animation, and I want to be a concept artist in design backgrounds. And what do you inspire when you design?
So much of commercial work is not just coming up with stuff on your own. You're working with a team, you're working with a director, you're working with probably an existing property. So it's a collaboration. You listen to the other ideas that the people you're working with have. You try to find references. You try to build consensus. I wish it was just as simple as coming up with an idea. It's so much more than that. It's so much more complex than that in terms of the dynamics of who you're working with and how this stuff comes about. And there might be a misconception that, you know, we've got ultimate authority to just do whatever we want, and that's just not true. You're always working with a group. You're always working with other people.
So with that said, how important would you weigh people skills with art skills?
Yeah, people skills are huge. Learning to read a room, learning to listen, learning to, you know, when do you bring your idea? When do you listen to what they want? When do you suggest? When do you question? That's, yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah, they don't even begin to touch that stuff in school.
Whenever I speak to students, I always say the number one unspoken rule is to be kind, because no one wants to hire an asshole.
I was looking at a book and it was on Steadicam operation. And the greatest piece of advice I found in that book was the guy said, always make them glad they hired you. And my interpretation of that is like, you're not brown nosing. You're not trying to show them every single day, you know, what a suck up you are. You're trying to prove to them every single day that you're contributing, so that whenever you speak up or say something or add something, it's actually contributing rather than you trying to say, hey, look how clever I am. That's a big one. There's a lot of ego in this business on both sides. And so making your employers like, oh my God, I'm so glad that guy is on our team. Having them have that feeling isn't accidental. Some people just have really naturally like buoyant personalities. And, you know, they call that whatever, charm and charisma. but it's important to be aware of, because they can fire you and replace you the next day and the project's still going to go on. So don't ever think that you're irreplaceable. Don't ever think that, like, you know, what your idea is so important that you know, the project will die without you. It's simply not true.
How do you
It really is part of a team.
How do you stay inspired creatively with all those constraints?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, you know, there's so many things out there that are so inspiring, whether it's photography or great art, shooting pictures, editing small movies, trying to analyze how other directors and editors have made, you know, things amazing. The best teacher is your own mistakes and your own shortcomings. I think too many people, well, at least it's easy today to watch a bunch of really clever, really well put together, thoughtful video essays and think, oh, well, I actually did something creative today. It's like, no, you just followed someone else's idea of what they thought someone else was doing. When you sit down and make your own drawing or make your own short film, it's so hard. It's so frustrating. There's so many little pieces that can go wrong. And it's inspiring to study other films that seamlessly work. And until you try to do it yourself, you go, oh my gosh, you know, they're literally working on another level. If you can tell a story so well, so seamlessly through the acting and the editing and the photography that you get caught up in the emotion of it, even though the thing is actually shot over a week and shot out of order and you don't notice it, they're pulling together some kind of like magic that seems effortless until you try to recreate it. And it's the same with drawing and painting. It's so easy to, you know, thumb through Pinterest or Instagram and look at other people's artwork and feel like you accomplished something. It's a lot harder to sit down and, you know, do your own work and find your own voice and try to, you know, work through your own failures. Yeah, the other way is much easier and you feel like you're accomplishing stuff, but you're not.
Now, Rob, I have a question.
Yes.
When you, before you started working on film, do you feel like you needed to go back to maybe studying like filmography, photography through like looking at films that you loved and seeing what kind of shots they used to make something dynamic or storytelling wise, and do studies off those shots?
No.
And if that helped.
I did in the, you know, I did in the beginning, but again, you're just copying. The benefit is you see their plan and their organization. The disadvantage is you're not solving the problem yourself. You're just recreating what they've already solved. So you're not building that muscle. Yeah, I looked at a lot of Caleb Deschanel's work to understand why his staging was so good, but that doesn't help you become, it makes you aware, but it doesn't help you become a better visual stager. You have to do that yourself. It's like watching a video of somebody else working out. You may glean a little bit of technique, but until you get out and do that thing yourself, you're probably not going to get much better at it. Another question, let's see, some distortion thing. I just get so tired of everything that's so perfect. When I had to learn perspective in college, we had to do it the old-fashioned way, where you had a plan drawing and you projected it and you did your vanishing points, and it's so horrible and so tedious. And we learned to do perspective so well you kind of forget it. You could kind of eyeball something and have it be really, really accurate. But that's because we did it the hard way. We did it the sort of like really gross old-fashioned way. And yes, I love building stuff in SketchUp because it's so much faster and I will do that any day. But I can still, if I have to, sit down and draw something. So when I'm looking at a shape and I'm judging it in perspective, you know, I also can tell when something's correct, and I can also go, okay, that's correct, but it's boring. Is there some way I can do something to it to make it more interesting? Because ultimately the image has to be interesting. At least it should. At least it should try to grab someone's attention. What else do we have? What else do you want to talk about?
I love your graphic LA series. What like made you choose those particular streets? Like how long of a project was that?
So the way that came about, let me see if I can find a page with some stuff and we can kind of walk through it.
And that's all personal.
Yeah, I never set out to do graphic LA. It came about from teaching and from loving plein air. So let's go into the Wayback Machine here. Give me a second. Here we go. So when I was teaching at Art Center, and what screen are you guys looking at? The wrong one probably, right? How about this screen? When I was teaching at Art Center, we would go out and we would paint from life on laptops. And this was done on an old little iBook, an old iBook that had swappable batteries. So you could get about 4 to 5 hours worth of painting outdoors. And we had to build these foam core boxes so that we could see the screen. It was quite the process. And I would come back and, like I said, I would look at these things and go, okay, the color's good. The values are good, but oh my God, it's just a boring picture. There's no drama to it. There's no story to it. It's kind of a dull snapshot. And one of the things I struggled with my students was just trying to get them to make a statement, trying to get them to make a direct statement. And it's like, no, turn off the opacity on the brush. No, don't have a soft brush. No transfer setting, turn that off. And eventually I just made them paint with the line tool. And you can take the line tool and set it to 100 pixels or 50 pixels or 300 pixels. And I said, you have to paint with only the line tool and 100% opacity. And they were actually coming up with some pretty interesting things. And it was like, I wonder how far I could take this idea. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll do a landscape painting with just, squares or triangles or circles. That's all I will use is pure geometric shapes. And then if I want to, I'll, do a distort or a skew on them, but I have to make everything out of like, those sort of marquee shapes. And because I had painted so long from life and, sort of looked at and interpreted values and colors, when I got around to doing it in the sort of straight geometry, the illusion was still there. Of the reality. It was just done with very, very, very geometric tools. And it still had enough reality to it that I went, how far could I take this? And mostly if you get a really good design, really good composition, and you get your value relationships right and your color somewhat right, it all looks pretty real. Now, none of these are the graphic LA thing. All of these things are the sort of like, plein air, going for that traditional look, trying out different types of ways to paint in Photoshop or Painter. This one was actually done in Painter. These are all from life, every one of these. And, to greater or lesser extent of success. Most of the times I would just look at these things when I got home, when I didn't have the glory of nature in front of me. I look at these things at home and go, why is that so dull? What can I do to tell a better story? What can I do to tell a more interesting story? And from that sort of came about this idea of like, well, they're just simple shapes, really. If I can break this down into a few simple shapes. This one was one of the aha moments, because when I got back, I was like, this is so dull. And then when I really looked at it in terms of what was going on, not the details, but like what's really going on here. What's going on here is terrible. I've got this one awkward triangle bumping into this square and this little lone thing down in here. It's like, oh my God, if I were to do that as an abstract with just black and white, I would go, I've almost divided my canvas in half. I'm making a tangent here. What's this guy doing over here? if I could break this down into an abstract pattern, I wouldn't paint it. I'd be like, that's bad design. And so that's when I really started looking at, like, what am I doing, and how can I treat these things as abstract shapes to move around, or to move my viewpoint around, until I find, a dynamic that works in the most interesting, bold way in the fewest values. So none of these I feel are terribly successful in terms of images, but they taught me a lot, and I got a lot of brush mileage out of them, and a lot of observation from life, which is so much harder than painting from a photograph, because you're having to group things, you're having to squint down, you're having to simplify things. Photograph does most of that for you. Photograph does the perspective for you. This was one of the very first I did on the laptop, and before I figured out the black box thing, I could only paint at night or in interior because there was so much glare on the screen. So I remember seeing these hoods over monitors when they would shoot, and then we started building our own little black foam core hoods, and then we kept modifying them and sort of designing them to the point where it actually covered up most of the screen. You could stick your head in there and actually see values with some degree of accuracy. And this is all before 9/11 too, before, you could bring a class of people painting on laptops into Union Station, and not so much now, I'm guessing. But going back to the question of, like, this is the, when you're stuck in, this is from Caltech. When you're there for, a day, you're trying to look for something every couple hours. And this is like, okay, well, I think down the street is going to make an interesting composition. But nowadays, when I look at it, I think, you know what? There's nothing really important here. The cars are important. The foliage is important. So if I had bothered to walk a little bit closer and maybe made one of the cars larger, it might have been a stronger picture. And so when I started realizing that, and I started looking at the most simple shapes that I could to begin with, and designing the silhouettes to have the most interesting breakup that I could, then I think I started making much better pictures, because I treated them as symbols rather than as reality. Mm. So I could see this just as a big shape, And these are some of the very first. Now, this one was funny because it only rains in California like 1 or 2 weeks out of the year. And so I found this little covered area in Pasadena. All right, I can sit back here, because I knew the rain was coming on this one Saturday. But I could sit back here, and I think the computer would be out of the light, or out of the rain, and I'll just sort of wait and do a quick sketch. And then I blocked everything in, then I took it home, and like just the smallest bit of motion blur suddenly makes things look like they're real. And then it's like, if I organized my textures, I can almost make anything work. I can almost make, as long as the shape has some truth to what's originally there, I just started pushing the abstracts more. And I started looking at this less as a vegetation and more as just a piece of calligraphy, and more as a design, and how I can start treating it as an abstract design. And Sid Mead kind of does the same thing, except just he takes that last little bit of rendering farther and makes it a little bit more realistic, but there's still an interesting pattern underneath of the stuff that he's doing. And the same with this rock. It's just, I tried to literally break up the light and dark space in the most graphic, interesting calligraphic way that I could. And there was a lot of like erasing and trying and adding on to just the 2-value thing. And then just playing around with textures, and then playing around with another texture that gives the impression of, rock or veins in the rock. And then just making the wet sand just a 2-value read, and then sort of stretching it and using the transform tools to make it a little bit more sitting on the ground plane, a little bit more, because to do this kind of stuff, analog, the old way, is super hard to get that drawing. This way you can spend some time making the pattern, and then you can just transform and push and, you know, get that last little bit of perspective, and you don't have to throw away all these little shapes that you spent hours making. And this one's interesting because it's really just the blue. It's almost a black and white painting except for the blue sky. And this all started off as a very graphic cut out shape that you just sort of play with the edges and soften a little, very lost and not so lost. And if the value pattern is there and if the shape itself is interesting, and Edgar Payne is doing the same thing. He's making super interesting graphic shapes for clouds that have a sense of drama to them. And if you can block the stuff out with, in the beginning, early on, and, you know, it's got some kind of boldness to it, it's just like good structure in a screenplay. For me, it just doesn't happen accidentally. Yeah, I've seen other people where it does happen, and they just have a more innate ability to design pictures without having to, like, you know, be so analytical about it. I've just found what works for me. Everyone is different, though. You know, everyone thinks differently. Everyone has different strengths and different weaknesses, and so I found what works best for me, but it doesn't mean it's going to work, you know, the exact same for everybody else. And then I got to the point too where I was like getting bored with the same colors, so I started going in with the curves and, like, you know, taking the midpoint and pushing it, and I found I could get a film emulsion look by doing that. It's like, oh, if I take the red point and, you know, drag it up, oh, and I lift my reds and I lift my blues, it looks like film emulsion rather than like, oh my God, why do I always pick the same green? Why do my skies always look the same? And I would come back and I'd just be so bored by my own stuff that I could, by playing around with the curves and the levels, at least I could, you know, try to shift the color scheme. Everything still had its basis in something that was observed and something that was correct, but by skewing the color scheme, it just had something a little bit more interesting to me, something that was less, you know, like, oh my God, same blue sky. Because when you're painting from life, you know, by and large, you need the setting to remain consistent. And the most consistent light is from about, you know, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and that's the dullest light. So I'd always come back with the same greens and the same blues, and it's like, oh my God, this is so boring.
I love it. I mean, obviously I live in LA, so I'm inspired by the streets of LA as well, but I really enjoy your interpretation of them.
It just came out of plein air painting. You know, it's just like, how far can I take this? And then when the iPhone came out, I discovered that, like, before, you're painting into a black box and you're kind of looking into the black box and you're looking up, you're looking into the black box. So when the phone came out and they started having really crude painting apps on the phone, and this is long before Procreate, you know, you kind of had to keep the phone right up here when you were working. And one thing I stumbled across was like this ability to make a direct comparison to the tones in front of me. It was like, it's called sight size. They've been doing this for hundreds of years. But by being able to flick the phone up and down, I was like, oh, wait, this value is off, because I'm doing a direct comparison to what's in front of my eyes. I'm like, oh, let me darken this. No, let me lighten this. And by blocking stuff out with that direct way, my stuff got even more accurate. And then the iPad came out, and at least you had a slightly bigger phone to paint on.
Love that.
But all that informed my my commercial work. You know, when you paint from life and you try to interpret colors, and then you sort of bring that same thinking. It's like good screenplay writing, in that, you know, good screenplay writing is observed behavior. It seems naturalistic, but it's all contrived, but it has a naturalistic feel to it. It's the same with painting from life. When you're looking at something that's super complex, but how do you break it down into 3 or 4 value groups? Once you kind of learn how to do that and how to kind of push that around, then you can take anything imaginary and go, well, I know value structure does this in real life. I know the sky is usually the brightest thing because I've done it so much, and that's what feels right. So as long as I can get that sky to maintain a certain value in my made up piece, it maintains a sense of believability and a sense of realism to it, or naturalism to it.
Awesome. Obviously you mentioned Sid Mead, and that you are inspired by other artists. Like, what are some artists that you that were inspired by early on? Or
everybody. John Singer Sargent, Thomas Cole. Early on, as a kid, I would walk into the museum and look at Thomas Cole and go, why does that look so real? And then I discovered Sargent, and it's like, why does this look so real? Because when I get up close to it, it's just nothing. It's just abstract, and I step back from it and it looks real. So realism to me was never about detail. It was always about, there's some greater truth they're grasping. There's some greater visual value relationship that they're understanding. So I started digging more into that, and it's like, all right, so what is this value reality? And how do I get my stuff to have that same, believability? And it always came down to grouping things into the fewest, for me, into the fewest possible values. Getting the effect. My head painting teacher in Calabasas would always say, go for the big shapes. And it's the same thing when painting from life. You're getting the effect first. You want the effect first. And if you can, get those few relationships that make the effect look believable, if you can get that early on and you stay within those groupings that you initially did, then the thing will just have a certain realism to it.
You've mentioned working on short films a couple of times. Is that something that you're also doing?
Yeah, it's pretty obsessive, because it sort of combines everything that you've learned about visual art making with, pacing and real motion. So yeah, making short films is, it seems like to me a natural extension of just drawing and painting, because you're taking, and given the sorry, it's late in the day. Given what I do for a living, I work in the motion picture industry. The more I understand real cutting and how to light something and, sequential storytelling, the more I understand that, it just informs me more on how my one shot is going to fit into the entire sequence. You know what I mean? Because you can spend all your time designing a shot that doesn't fit into a sequence, and therefore it is not successful. It has to cut. It has to work into the visual story that they're telling. It's not just about you having your moment. It's about, does the moment enhance the story and the acting?
Absolutely.
What am I doing?
I have a question.
Hi, Rob.
Hey.
How's it going? It's Ryan Meinerding. How's it going?
Oh, hi, Ryan.
Thanks for doing this.
Oh, sure.
I had a question, which is, it's just maybe stupidly specific, but it's also by virtue of, like, if I ever was going to try and, when I do keyframes or when I'm thinking about things, I don't do environment design really, but the notion of, like, I've experienced like an early morning before school back when I was a kid, and like the notion of how that lighting felt. And I don't, I'd have to really research and see what that sort of feeling meant. When you're working on stuff, do you access like those types of things? Like does your like visual library for lighting and things kind of travel back in your experiences having lived as a human for so long? Or is it mostly about the study that you've done, and or when those things communicate in a painting that's meant for a film, do you feel like that's inherently driven by the narrative and that's why people are going to feel it? Or do you feel like you can make people connect to that kind of thing without it having to like filter through the narrative of the film.
Well, I don't think we can intellectualize the stuff to the point where we're not bringing ourselves to it. Ultimately, we're hired because we're bringing something to it as a human being. So even though they say, I want, this color palette, you're not just a pair of wrists. You're going, okay, what does this mean to me? What's something that I've seen, that I've connected with, that then I can bring that into their needs. Does that answer the question?
It does.
Yeah.
I think I find myself when I'm doing character design, I can feel the character. There's other things. There's things that I can like lock into that I sort of have a process with.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to do a keyframe, a lot of times I feel like I'm searching for something, or a keyframe, or just a moment. Like I'll search for something that I feel like is incredibly specific, that I feel like I get and that I see, and then I end up showing it to people. And either it's just not important that stuff communicates, but it also it feels like a lot of times I'm reaching for something that's too personal, that's sort of like, no, don't you know what it's like in that early morning before school, and that like energy, and like that weird sort of like, you're tired but you're still, I don't know.
Well, I think you always have to grab for that, even though it doesn't feel like anyone else appreciates it, because you're connecting with something, right? And we do this because we're trying to, whether we've felt something or seen something, we need to communicate that as an artist. You need to communicate that feeling. And if you can show somebody else and they get what you felt, it's like, oh, I've seen a morning like that. Right. Then you've bridged that connection between us as a species, which is like, it's kind of the ultimate, right? And I think that's a little bit of what makes the Marvel movies so successful, is even though they're telling these grandiose stories, there's something that's connecting to us as human beings, and our desires and our aspirations and our hopes that we all share.
Right on, man. Well, thanks for answering. Appreciate it.
Is there someone in the world who will also relate to your work? God, there's got to be, right? Yeah. And there's niche artists and there's popular artists. Thomas Dewing was a niche artist in that most people go, Thomas who? But for me, when I stumbled across his stuff, I was blown away. But his stuff is so subtle and so quiet that most people are just like, what was that? I don't know. Someone was whispering. I don't care. But Thomas Dewing to me was like, oh my God. So yeah, he spoke to me, but obviously not to a larger part of the population, because I'm not sure if anyone else has ever heard of Thomas Dewing, but he was one of my favorites.
Has anyone on the stream tonight heard of him? Just for fun?
No.
No. Yeah.
Does anyone oh, sorry, Rachel.
I was going to say, I'm not an artist, so I don't know that name. That's going to be my excuse. But is this someone that's still alive, or like?
No, all the good people are dead. All the good people.
If there was if there was a piece of art like by his that people should like go and check out, like, is there some like specific pieces of that guy?
There's one called The Lute Player that's pretty amazing. He was kind of Richard Schmid before Richard Schmid was Richard Schmid. And so he was one of the first people starting to really experiment with these really soft edges, these lost edges, and just subtle, quiet tonality of work. But yeah, it's not immensely popular,
Jason Goodfriend says he said his statement, Thomas Dewing likes green.
I dropped a link to that image in the chat, and it happens to be very green. So.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful.
Yeah. Let me click on this and see if it's the one I'm thinking of.
How do you spell the last name?
Dewing. Oh, that's one. Yeah. But yeah, those are pretty quiet pictures.
Okay. Is anyone drawing tonight? Sometimes people are.
Yep.
Jose?
Oh, Hector's drawing.
Yeah, it's too
I
hard.
enabled multi-screen share, so if anybody wants to throw their art up and ask Rob some questions, or if you have any questions for Rob in general, just let us know.
So it's